Hey fellow explorers, one of my most frequently asked questions here on the channel is, Chris, I'm coming to the USA. How much do I tip? When do I tip? What should I tip for? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today because in particular, Twinson764 left me a comment 6 days ago that said, Chris, the next live stream should be about tips, when to tip and when not to tip and all of that. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But before I get into tipping, this isn't actually the first video I've made about how to tip in the USA. I made one of these about 4 years ago, but COVID has really changed things a lot in the US, and so I thought it was worthwhile to make this update rather than just point Twinson to the 4-year-old video. In particular, I feel like the trend we're going through in the US is tipflation, where tip numbers are rising more, where people expect more tips, and you get asked to tip more often in more places, and so the term tip fatigue is pretty high in the US news cycle. So before we get into all of the situations when you should tip, I first want to start with a little bit of history about tipping, like how did tipping get started in the US, where did it come from, and I think that will then help you understand how and when to tip and the theory behind it. And we can also have the whole conversation at the end after all the tips about when to tip, about should tipping be a thing in the US or not. All right, so how did tipping get started in the USA? Well, it all started back in the 1850s. Before the 1850s, tipping was not a thing in the USA, but around this time in history, wealthy Americans were traveling to Europe, and they noticed that there was a tradition in Europe where the wealthy Europeans would give a small token of gratitude to their servants when they did well. And so these wealthy Americans that came back from their travels in Europe in the 1850s brought the custom back with them and started tipping people who were serving them in the USA. In particular in restaurants. Now, the majority of folks in the US were actually fairly against the tradition that these wealthy Americans brought back from Europe. I mean, really, how could poor Americans be expected to tip for their food on top of the price? Sure, the wealthy people could afford it, but what about the people that weren't that wealthy? And in fact, there was so much anti-tipping sentiment in the USA that spread back to Europe, and in Europe actually tipping stopped while tipping continued to grow in the USA. So it was really, though, the end of slavery that really made tipping a thing in the USA, because a lot of these people who were former slaves, what were they going to do for work? And so many employers started offering former slaves work in places like restaurants or railroad porters, except there was a catch. They weren't going to pay them anything. They were going to work for tips. So that was like the deal. You work here, I don't pay you, but the guests who are wealthy people, they're going to pay you in tips. Okay, so it's better than being a slave. But Americans really still didn't like it, and so there was a lot of anti-tipping sentiment. Here's Miss Morgan in her War Against Tips from an old newspaper clipping. In fact, there was so much anti-tipping sentiment that 48 states within the U.S., there's 50 states in the U.S., 48 different states had passed various laws against tipping, and one of the laws didn't make it illegal to tip, but it made it illegal as an employee to receive a tip in one of the states. But none of those laws are on the books today because they were all repealed or struck down by higher levels of courts in these states. So when tipping now really became a thing is on June 25th, 1938. What's special about this date? This is when Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. And this act did some great things. It banned child labor. That's a good thing. It set the notion of the typical 40-hour work week in the USA. What it also did was it set the minimum wage in the USA. And at the time, the minimum wage wasn't very much, but today, the minimum wage in the USA is $7.25 according to the federal government in the USA, unless you're in a position that receive tips. If you receive tips, then you only have to be paid $2.13 per hour. There's only 7 states in the USA that mandate a minimum wage that must be paid regardless of tips. But in many of the states, the restaurant worker who receives tips may only be getting paid $2.13 by their employer, expecting that the rest of that is going to be made up with tips. And of course, what's funny with this whole chat is Grovel said, "Don't forget to tip Chris." Grovel, thank you for the tip. I appreciate it. Okay, so now one of the things that also has kind of made tipping complicated and how it's changed a little bit in the recent years is that under that law in 1938 that solidified tips and minimum wage, there was a provision that said the tips could not be pooled, meaning that if a server received tips or a railroad porter received tips, the person who received the tips, that tip was theirs, and the employer could not force that person to share the tips with the rest of the staff. That has changed. In 2018, the U.S. Department of Labor passed a law that now allows various schemes for pooling of tips. So although you may be giving a tip to the server, that tip may be pooled to also go to the people who bust the tables, or also go to the back of the house staff, like the people who cook. And so then if you say, well, Chris, why do people in the U.S., why do people like tipping in the U.S.? And a couple arguments for it and a couple arguments against it that I'm going to present here, and then we'll go into all of the different tips about how, when, and why you may wish to tip. So the common explanation for tipping is that tipping in the restaurant industry today is an incentive for servers to work harder, because they know if they work harder or please their customers more, they're going to get a bigger tip. Sometimes people say tip is an acronym, and the TIP stands for to ensure promptness. Which it doesn't really, but that's kind of the mental model that many people say. If you take a long time, if you're slow, then you don't get as good of a tip, but as a server, if you do better, then you get a higher tip. Obviously, there's a lot more situations than just restaurant server that people get tipped in, but that's certainly one of the first ones that we're going to talk about. Now, on the other side of the argument, there's many people who say tipping does not improve service, and they cite countries like Japan, where restaurant servers or anybody really isn't tipped, but yet service is somehow impeccable. Then on the other hand, people might point out countries like France, where there's no tipping and yet the service is not that great, at least by American standards, where Americans want their water glass refilled every 2 minutes. By the way, when I say Americans, much of this, at least the culture of tipping, is shared between the USA and Canada. So if you're going to Canada, much of this applies there as well. Canyon Overlook says, I worked at a restaurant in 79 and they pooled tips. I was a busboy. So against the federal law, but that didn't mean that people didn't do it. And Canyon Overlook says, one of the things that makes tipping kind of weird practice is related to expensive restaurants and inexpensive restaurants, like the inequality of servers, that if you're at an inexpensive restaurant, the tips are all really low. But if you're at an expensive restaurant, then the tips are really high. And so, does that make sense? Is that fair between those two servers? And then Brandon points out, related to Japan, that the standards in Japan are miles above any other country. And Kathy says, in Australia, the service is up and down. We don't tip here. All right, so let's go on to this last perspective that I want to give you, and then we'll get into where and how you should tip. So the biggest change I think that we've had in the USA in the last 4 years since I've made the last guide on tipping is all the technology that's now in place that happened to us from COVID. The prevalence of online ordering, the prevalence of ordering from tablets, the prevalence of these computer screens that now prompt you at most restaurants as to whether you want to tip and how much you want to tip. And so while there's always been some percentage of people in the USA that have had a negative view of tipping, I think it's been greatly increased by all these screens that just you're bombarded with every day to ask you to tip. And often how this works. So as I said previously, the decision to tip was it was never an overt question. It was like, there's a tip jar over here, or you can put some extra money in the folder. But that's kind of like a decision up to you. But now this gets put in front of your face, and the cashier never says, hey, can you please on the screen decide how much to tip me? The cashier generally says something like, can you answer the question on the screen? Oh, there's one question for you to answer over there. It's always this very vague, like pointing you to answer the question, this very vague question, as of course they then watch you to see whether you press the button to tip them or whether you press the button to not tip them. And it's really different. It's a really different experience than just a tip jar that happens to be on the side of the cash register. A recent survey by Bankrate found that roughly 66% of Americans they surveyed had a negative view of tipping. And around 30% of the respondents to the survey had more than just a negative view of tipping. They felt that tipping culture in the USA is in fact out of control because more companies are prompting their customers to tip than ever before. 32% of people find when the screens are pre-entered to be aggravating. So one version of this prompt, and the one that you see here, and I'll make this bigger so you can see it. It comes up like this. You put in your credit card, and then it says select tip, and you gotta push a button. Another version of it is one of them is already highlighted for you, and then you can just push enter to go on. And so many people find that aggravating when it's already selected for you instead of having the option to go ahead and select it. And then 42% of the people that Bankrate surveyed felt that companies should pay their employees more instead of relying on gratuity or tips. Okay, that's enough background, and that's enough of my rant for now. We'll get into my rant more about how tipping is out of control at the end. But let's get into when, where, and how much you should tip, broke it down into 15 of the most common places that you'll be prompted to tip. Okay, the first setting that is the most often setting where you'll be expected to tip in the USA is at a restaurant. And while like all tipping is optional, it's pretty well expected that you're going to tip something if you're going to a full service restaurant. That's a restaurant where you're seated at a table, you get a menu, you order from a server, they bring you your food, and they clean up the table after you. That's generally a full service restaurant. And so the standard tip math at a full service restaurant is that you leave 15% extra if your experience wasn't awful. 18 to 25% if it was good or great. Now, what you'll notice actually back on this last one related to tipflation, this one gave a 10% option, a 20% option, but some of these screens you'll see are offering things like 30% or more. And that's another one. People are like, when did that ever become a tip? And that became a tip during COVID, where people were just so happy to go to a restaurant and people working for them that they were giving bigger tips. But now those tip numbers are coming back down to earth again. So at full service restaurants in the US, they rarely will bring your check to you unless you ask. The time that they'll typically bring your check to you is if they're tired of you and they want you to leave, and then they're like, can you please pay? But most of the time you have to ask. If it's a typical American restaurant, you ask your server, hey, can I have the check? Hey, can I have the bill? And then they bring you some folder that looks like this that has a piece of paper that itemizes what that's in there. If you're at like typically an Asian restaurant, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, you can typically ask anybody there for the bill. If you're at a typically American restaurant like Cheesecake Factory or Denny's, then you need to ask your server, your waiter, your waitress. They're the only person that will bring you your check. If you ask somebody else, they'll be like, I'll go find your server and tell them, because they don't care to help you because they're not getting your tip. Only your server is generally getting your tip. Now, you're expected to tip whether you're paying with cash or card, but how you tip depends on whether you're paying by cash or card. So if you're paying by cash at a full-service restaurant, you've got two options. In this little folder that they give you, or cup, or however this check bill comes, you can place, if you have like exact change, like if this is $167 and you're a generous tipper, you want to leave a tip of $33. Let's say you had $200. You could put that $200 in there, close the folder, leave it on the table, and just leave. Like, you're not expected at most restaurants in the USA to stay there until they take your money or count your money. You put your money in, and if you don't want any change back, you close it, and you're done. You can peel out of there. If you do need change, then you can put the money in there and say, like, hey, could you bring me some change? If they're a smart server, they'll bring you your change back in small bills so that you have small bills to give them a tip with. If they didn't and they brought you back like 220s, you could say back to them, hey, can you bring change for this so I can leave you a tip? Dummy. Right. Maybe that, like, changes how much of a tip you give them. And then when you put the tip back in there, you don't give it to the server. You just leave it in that little folder. Again, whatever, the $7, $10, $20, 5 cents, however much you leave, you just leave it in that folder and you go ahead and leave. Most restaurants. If you're at a particularly sketchy restaurant, in a particular sketchy place, or maybe you're seated at like an outdoor table or something, then you might want to hand the folder back to the server and be like, here you go, if you're worried somebody else is going to make off with it. Okay, that's how you tip in cash at a full-service restaurant. How do you tip if you're paying by credit card? Well, in that folder, you'll put your credit card. They'll take your credit card away. This is something that like wigs out a lot of people not from the U.S. that are traveling here. You put your credit card in the folder, and there's usually a little pocket to put your credit card in at the top, and then they take it. They take it back to the cash register where they run your credit card, and they authorize it for some amount that's like how much food you ate plus 30%, because you might want to tip that much. And then they bring you this a receipt that looks like this. There'll generally be 2 copies. There's one for the restaurant and there's one for you. The one for you is for your records. The one for the restaurant, there's a little line on it where you write in how much you want to tip, and then you do some math and add that to a total, and then you sign your name right down here. And on this particular receipt, they've done some calculations to tell you what 15, 18, and 20% could look like in case you're extra lazy. Now, sometimes they'll make it easy for you, and they'll give you like boxes you can check about the tip that you want to leave. Now, note at this restaurant, on this particular check, this is a restaurant that was also charging a service charge. This is at Koi Palace in San Francisco area. Since COVID, they have now begun charging an 18% service charge on top of the prices, and so in that case, you actually don't have to tip. But if you really want to tip more, then they've got some boxes that you check about how much more you want to tip, and there's no way for you to tip a amount that's not one of these when you use your credit card at this particular restaurant. If you're at a restaurant that didn't charge a service charge, then the boxes would be more like 15, 18, 20%. Sometimes they got a box where you can write in your own. In the US, it is becoming more and more common for them to bring some card reader to your table and actually process the transaction right there. If that's the case, then they'll typically give you the reader, you'll tap your card or you'll insert it, and then the question about how much you want to tip will come up on the screen, and you'll have to go ahead and answer that question on the screen about how much you want to tip. Like I say, this is becoming more and more common, much like often how it's done in Europe. Now, sometimes I feel like lazy servers will actually like leave the credit card machine at your table and like walk away, and just like it's that trust factor that like you're gonna finish the transaction and I guess not steal their credit card machine. Now, if you're at a diner type restaurant that's not counter service completely, but that's something like Cracker Barrel is an example of this. Like it's a diner. In that case, they'll bring you the check, and then they'll tell you to like go pay up at somebody at the front. This is pretty rare in the USA. You generally do your whole payment transaction at the table. If you're going to pay up at front by somebody, you can generally expect them to tell you that. Now, the nuance at one of these types of places is then how do you tip your server? If you're paying by cash, then you'll probably leave your tip just money on the table that you ate at, and then you'll pay at the cashier. If you're paying by credit card, then they might let you do the tip for your server at the end for everybody. Brandon points out that many restaurants now have kiosks at the table. Yeah, I like that. That's a good point, Brandon. And I didn't put a picture of it in, but I should have. Like Olive Garden now has a kiosk at the table, kiosk like an iPad basically, or a tablet that you can like pay your bill from the iPad. The other new tech restaurants is like if some places where you don't like order from a server, but you order from like a QR code on the table, then sometimes you can actually pay your whole bill from your phone, which is interesting. Mel says that the pay at the exit is pretty common in Texas at Mexican restaurants. Yeah, I think I'd say even here there are some interesting like taco shops that are like fast food taco shops where you like go and you order you get your food and then you sit down and you eat it and then you go to the cashier and you tell the cashier what it is that you ate, and then they charge you. So I do love that honor system. MT, thank you for your support, MT. And MT says, Chris, if you pay by credit card, can you write in a negative tip to lessen your bill for lousy service? That would be nice. I would really like that. You know, if I ever talk to anybody at like Visa or MasterCard or these payment processing companies, I will bring that one up for you. And Andy S says, can you do the dishes instead of tipping? You know what? Maybe ask. Maybe give it a try. Heaven Knows says, do you tip at the Centurion Lounge or the Delta Sky Club? We're going to get to that when I talk about bars. I'll bring that up. And Mel says, make sure to always double check the tip percentages. I've caught several restaurants that had their numbers set wrong, and the 10, 15, 20% were much higher than the real math total. That's interesting, Mel. And you must be good at math to like catch those things on the fly. Okay. So the other thing to be aware of is this service charge thing. Is the restaurant charging a service charge? Do you know that ahead of time? If they are, then you don't have to like pay a tip. But you know what I often see. Actually, we're gonna do this one in a moment, so we'll go back here. If you're at a restaurant with a large party, like 6 people, 8 people, then many restaurants will tell you they're just going to add a mandatory tip on there, 18, 20%, if you have a large party. And you should be aware of these extra fees. There's a lot of extra fees now, more than just service charges, and we'll get into those towards the end about all the extra fees. Okay. Number 2, what's the second biggest situation you'll be expected to tip when you come to the USA? And it's going to be at counter service restaurants or coffee shops. So these are much more like casual type service things. And in this case, you might not be looking to tip 15 to 25%. You might be looking to tip $1 or something like that. So the most common way that you'll offer tips, like a coffee shop or a bakery or things like that, is a little jar on the side where it just says tips some various way, and if you're paying by cash, you just put your money in there that you want to leave as a tip for the barista or whomever. These are typically pooled, although you might go to places where they might have a name on them, tips for Sarah or Susie or John. In that case, put your money in the one that has the name of the person that you want to tip. Now, if you pay by card, then the reader may prompt you, just like this thing we looked at in the beginning of this. If you're at a coffee shop, I wouldn't necessarily tip them 10% or 20%. If you bought an expensive coffee, $1 or $2 is good for the service if it's extra nice. But you're really not expected to tip. Like the barista's not going to be torqued off if you didn't leave them $1 for making your coffee. And a lot of times, like on this screen, if you want to tip something else, like you didn't want to tip $3 and you want to tip $1, you can push the custom button and then you can peck in what you want to tip. The less advanced quick service restaurants may print a receipt that you have to fill out and sign, just like you did at the full service restaurant. And by the way, I see in the chat, Boston Elevators continues to support the channel. Thank you very much. And Kathy also as channel members for 5 months. So thank you very much for your support. I appreciate it. Kathy says she found tipping to be quite easy when she was in the USA. All right, that's good. Now, this is my note about surcharges. This is becoming more and more prevalent where the price on the menu is not the price that you pay. This restaurant that I ate at adds a 3% inflation surcharge, or you'll see a healthcare surcharge, cost recovery surcharge, electricity surcharge. I don't know. It's getting kind of ridiculous and out of hand, but do expect to see some of these nuisance surcharges. Often, if you complain about them, they'll take them off. Like at this place I really like for cakes, Susie Cakes, they'll say we have a 4% charge to cover our employees' health care. If you want it removed, please let us know. And other places, they'll just post a sign to be like 3% more or 4% if you pay for your credit card. So, you can factor that into your tip too. I'm thirsty. What am I drinking today? As we move on to bars, which is the next one. Today I'm drinking En Route Sparkling Cold Brew Tea. This is from a company in Los Angeles. This is peach, hibiscus, and jasmine green tea. I definitely taste the peach. I don't taste the tea so much. The hibiscus makes it a little like less sweet, maybe more tart. So it kind of tastes like a sparkling tart peach juice. I picked this up in Whole Foods in Newport Beach yesterday. Okay. The third area that people are going to tip a lot is in bars, where you order drinks. And so how much do you tip at a bar? Generally $1 to $2 for good service on your drink. Is the person just opening your bottle or is the person making a cocktail for you? And this is another one where the volume is so high at a bar, they make so many drinks for so many people, they're not going to be torqued off if you don't leave them $1 or $2 tip. But if you want to, that's what you could leave. They may not have a tip jar, but if you're paying in cash, if the drink was $9, you could give them $10 and you could tell them, hey, go ahead and keep the change. If it's $8 and you hand them a $10, you could say, hey, just give me back $1. That's a great way to handle that tip transaction. Or if you're paying by credit cards, then it's going to be the same procedure that we talked about before. If you are at a nightclub and like you paid for bottle service or table service and you're in like the $1,000 club and you got someone waiting on you all night, then consider tipping them like a restaurant. One people ask me a lot about, and so I've included this in here now, is if you go to the bathroom or the toilet and there's a washroom attendant who like hands you a mint or a towel, do you have to tip that person? No. What's a good tip for that person? $1 for handing you a towel. Unless you were just at the Bellagio and won, $10,000 at the slot machine, then you might feel a little bit more generous. Let's talk about taxis, the fourth area that is kind of like an expected tip sort of thing. So taxis, people often pay taxis in cash. Although credit cards are becoming more and more common, taxi drivers generally prefer cash because they probably pay less fees. And so if I'm going to be taking a taxi, I generally prepare small change or bills with me so that I can have some variant of the fare plus a tip that I can just hand to them. And I generally, if the fare is $40 and I'm going to tip something like 20% or 25%, then I'll give them a 50 or 2 20s and a 10 and just say, hey, go ahead and keep the change, or same remark about give me 5 or 10 back. Many taxis now realize they're in a world where they take credit cards, and so then you'll be able to tip generally on that point of sale terminal on the credit card reader. But you could also consider taking a taxi, paying your fare in cash, paying the $40 or paying the $40 by your credit card, and then giving them a $10 tip in cash. I am sure they would love that. Now, I think the thing you want to consider with your taxi is whether or not the taxi driver can pick up another fare right after they dropped you off, or whether they have to drive a long way back to get another fare. So, for example, if you're in the New York City metro area, like New York taxis can only pick up in New York. And so if you're taking a taxi from New York to New Jersey, like to Newark Airport, when they cross the state line to take you to New Jersey, they cannot pick up another fare to go back to New York. They can only pick up in New York. And so then you might want to consider giving the taxi driver a greater tip for the like extra inconvenience they have to like go back home. Let's talk about rideshare, Uber, and Lyft. And I feel this is an interesting one to talk about because I feel like when Uber started in the USA, like the premise was the price you see is the price you pay. Like tipping was not a thing in the Uber app to start. I mean, and I feel like that was like actually part of the culture and the premise of Uber. And then eventually all the drivers got together and be like, we don't make enough money. And so then Uber I'll put the tipping option in the app. I mean, originally Uber was against tipping and told the drivers, no tipping, you don't get to accept tips. And then Uber realized they weren't going to have a workforce like that. And so they enabled tipping. And now rideshare drivers generally expect about the same thing. You're going to tip a taxi. But you could also consider, you pay in the app for your fare. I'm sure they'd be happy to take a cash tip too. The sixth area that you'll be prompted to tip is in food delivery. If you're having Uber Eats or DoorDash or Grubhub, if you're having somebody like pick up food and deliver it to your hotel or to your house, you will be prompted in the app for a tip. The tip you're prompted for in the app is a tip that goes to the delivery driver, not a tip that goes back to any of the restaurant staff. And this is, I feel, one that like I don't think we have there's not like the same kind of hard and fast rule here as there is at restaurants. Some people will say tip 15 to 20% of your order. Other people will say tip them based on effort, like how far are they driving, how much do they have to pick up, how long did they have to wait. Business Insider surveyed some delivery drivers, and the delivery drivers said to them they felt 15 to 20% was a good tip. And one of the delivery drivers remarked that about 1 out of 5 people didn't tip them anything. So could you be one of those 5? You sure could be, although the delivery drivers definitely appreciate the tip. I simply give that for the perspective of how many people tip versus how many people don't tip. And I always, you can tip them in cash if they show up at your house too. I always tip them in the app because when I order food delivery, I just ask them to drop it off in front of my house so that if I'm otherwise occupied in the restroom or something like that, I don't have to be waiting by the front door. And Justin says it's easy not to tip in an Uber as you can do it after your ride and you'll never see the driver again. It's true, Justin. It just, of course I'll say for me, living in Orange County, I take a lot of Ubers to the airport, and surprisingly I do get a lot of the same Uber drivers. It was so funny. When I was at Comic-Con a couple months ago, I took an Uber from Comic-Con to my mom's house so that I could upload the footage that I recorded at Comic-Con. And I basically had the footage on my MacBook because I couldn't upload it from the convention. And so I got to my mom's house, I connected it on Wi-Fi, I started the upload, and as soon as it's done, it'll get published to YouTube. I didn't need to sit there, and so about 5 minutes after I was dropped off, I called Uber back up again, and the same driver who dropped me off came to pick me up again. He was like, you totally could have asked me to wait for you, but it took him a little bit. Like, he picked me up, and we were driving about 3 blocks, and he's like, you're the same guy I dropped off, and I'm like, I am the same guy you dropped off, that's right. So, you never know. I think it's generally good not to stiff the driver if you're in a place where you might see them again. Okay. The 7th area, this is new for my list this year, it wasn't in my list 4 years ago, is fast food. What? Fast food, Chris, tip at McDonald's or In-N-Out Burger. No, at In-N-Out Burger, there's not a tip jar. In-N-Out Burger, they'll have a jar that you can leave money to help the children in their medical care or something like that if they're seeking for a cause. But many places like Shake Shack right here actually prompt you now to tip through the app. So this is the big difference between 4 years ago and now, that many fast food restaurants have online ordering abilities like apps, and in the app they'll prompt you to tip. In the case of Shake Shack, in the app it'll be filled with a default tip. Like, it already starts with something like a 10% tip, which, like, the other day here on this picture, I was ordering some donuts, some malasadas, and I was ordering my donuts ahead. Chris, did you order 24 donuts? I ordered $24 of donuts. I ordered a lot of donuts. But it's like, add a tip for donuts, you know? I'm like, did they get a $5 tip for donuts? I don't think they get a $5 tip for donuts. That's just me. And so I don't think you need to tip at a fast food restaurant. But I think it's another one where, like, if they had good service and they have a tip jar, maybe they deserve a tip there. But it seems weird to leave a tip when you haven't even been to the place. In addition to weird fees, if you do find yourself ordering online, be aware of online ordering service fees, where they charge you like $1 more because you use the online ordering platform. I'm like, maybe you should charge me less because you didn't need a human to process the transaction. I don't know. All right. Number 8, the 8th area that you'll be expected to tip in the U.S. is if you're staying at a hotel. Housekeeping expects a tip, and it depends how much you tip based on the price of the room, how big the room is, and how dirty you make it. So, like, how much effort do they have to clean it? I would suggest you consider between $2 to $10 daily. Daily. The reason why daily, well, every day you get housekeeping. If they know nobody comes in your room, then you don't need to leave more tips because they didn't do anything. But you will have different housekeepers that clean your room on different days. And so if you leave the whole tip at the end, maybe the person who got it isn't the person who cleaned your room for the last 3 days. So consider leaving that tip every night or every morning that you have housekeeping come in. Where do you leave it? You can just leave the cash on your bed or on the nightstand. Where do you get the cash? If you don't have cash, the front desk will be happy to help you make some change. Number 9 is bellboys or at hotels, people who help you with your luggage or people who help you with your luggage at airports. The general thought is if you've got like big luggage like this, something like $1 to $2 per bag. $5 total is probably something to consider good. If you've got like a gigantic luggage cart, you don't really need to add it up. But if they're pushing it a long way to your room, the difference between Japan and the USA. In Japan, they'll happily deliver it to your room and leave. And in the USA, they'll deliver it to your room and stand around for a little while to see if you're going to give them a few dollars. And so if you are expecting them to take your heavy bags around, think about it. Have a few bucks available as you get to the hotel to do that. Valet parkers are another typically tipped area. How much you tip them, in my mind, depends on whether your valet is a free valet or a really expensive hotel valet, and how much they hustle to get your car. You know, if the valet parker's like really running to get your car, maybe they deserve a little bit more because they're like really putting a lot of effort in. I tend to tip when I pick up my car, but you can also tip them when you give them your keys and tell them to keep your car safe and park it in a nice place. How much do you tip? You know, another one, $1 or $2, I think, is reasonable for valets because they're doing a lot of them and it's a pretty quick transaction. The 11th area is the hotel concierge. If you're staying at a hotel and you go to the concierge and you ask them to make restaurant reservations or get you some hard-to-get show tickets, how much you tip them depends on how much effort, how difficult that thing was. If you just ask them for directions to the nearest Starbucks, they're not expecting a tip. But if they're planning a really complicated itinerary for you, that's probably worth more. The front desk staff, people say, it's kind of like 50-50 split on this one, but particularly in Vegas, they say if you're checking in and, between your credit card and your driver's license, if you put like $20 in there and ask them if they have any upgraded rooms, that tip of $20 might be enough to have them put you in that strip view room. I'll tell you, I've never done it, and I get plenty of upgrades, not because I wear a yellow shirt, but because of how I book or hotel leap status or things like that. But you could totally consider the $20 trick. Joe says, tip them when they give you a welcome drink. There you go. That's another way to do it, too. Janelle says, I stayed 5 days at Resorts World, 0 housekeeping. I left a 0 tip. Yeah, I mean, if they don't clean your room, I don't see anything wrong with that, Janelle. Other than your housekeeper doesn't get the tip, but there is a certain bit of this, tip fatigue where we also have to vote with our money a little bit too, right? If the hotel's like nobody's tipping, it's because you're like, maybe because you're not cleaning my room anymore. Okay, the 14th area that I missed 13. 13th area is tour guides. Why did I put this picture? I was recording one of my walking tours at Disneyland and wearing this silly headset microphone, so I look like a tour guide. If you take a walking tour for an hour or two, consider giving a few bucks for your tour guide. If you've taken an all-day tour with a tour guide, a 20 might be more appropriate. The area that people really hate now is at self-checkouts. You go to self-checkout, and this has been stories about this in airports, and I've had it happen to me at a self-checkout at an unattended store in an airport. It's prompting me for a tip. I'm like, there's nobody here to tip, and I'm so not tipping the computer. And the 15th area, this is probably more for people who live in the USA, call the USA home, but I had to include it because this was the complete guide to tipping in the USA, is handy people that come to your home to fix your plumbing or your appliances or something like that. If they're just there for a little bit of time, maybe $5. If they're there all day and they did a good job, maybe $20, something like that. You don't have to. They probably don't expect a tip, but if you say hey, here's $20 to go get yourself a good lunch or go get yourself a good dinner, something they always appreciate. The other tips I always give to handy people that come to my house is cold water, because if they're doing hard work, they appreciate it if they just get something cold to drink. All right, as I wrap up this agenda topic right here, I want to put up this little fortune cookie that I got the other day that says, your mentality is alert, practical, and analytical. So these are my analytical thoughts about tipping and where we are in this state of tipping. Really, I feel like the biggest thing with tipping today is this tipflation, where the tips were being prompted more. So tip fatigue is a real thing, and 30% people are like, I don't know about that. And the fact that it's now a question really creates this uncomfortable interaction with a sense of pressure being exerted on the customer about whether they should tip and how much. There's a TED Talk that somebody did titled "The Tipping Invasion: How America Became the Country That Tips for Everything, Everywhere, All at Once." And that's what it seems like every once in a while right now. If you're coming to the USA, you shouldn't feel obligated to tip every time you're asked for it. You've listened to my list as to where you should tip and where you shouldn't tip. 15 and 20% for full service restaurants, taxis. Those are the big ones for 15, 20%. And, most other transactions, $1 or $2 for high volume transactions, 5 to 20 for longer volume transactions. And then the question of, should we tip or should we not tip? I mean, I'd rather pay a service fee and not tip. That's just me. I just like it built in. Let's know what it is. Let's all go ahead and agree on this and just make it what the price is. But it's unfortunate we've ended up in this bizarre minimum wage trap where people don't get paid enough, and now the customers have to subsidize how much they get paid. So that's where we are on tips. All right, let's go to some Q&A.
Fellow explorers, it is now Q&A time. If you've got a question, I've got an answer.
As I drink some more peach juice. But I don't know, in addition to questions, what do y'all think? If you visited the USA, what about tipping? Was it out of control? If you live in the USA, is tipping out of control? Janelle says, I feel like the guy who empties my septic tank deserves more of a tip than the waitress with a bad attitude. Couldn't agree with you more, Janelle. And I did see a comment that says handy people charge too much, $125 an hour. I mean, this also depends, are you paying them because it's their company, or do they work for a company that you're paying? And so, if the person I've got at my house is I'm paying them because it's their company, I'm probably not going to tip them. But if they work for Joe's Plumbing and this isn't Joe, then this person's probably going to get a tip. Brandon Torres says, no one gets paid enough these days except the higher paying jobs. Kathy says, all of our prices are built in, so no tipping, much easier. And Brian says, for the handy people that come to his house, he gives them a beer and they love it. Maybe I should take that tip, Brian. That's a good idea. I bet they do. I'd probably wait till the end of the day to give them a beer so that they don't get too sloppy on their work. Brooklyn Joe says, my favorite is at Costco. When they ask me if I'd like to donate to a certain cause, then I ask them if they'd like to come and clean my windows. Brooklyn Joe, has anybody taken you up on that offer? I'm curious, because if you've been able to get your windows cleaned that way, I'm going to try that too. Chase said, tipping is also out of control here in Canada. Yeah, Chase, I think we, the U.S. and Canada, share much of this same tipping culture. Thank you for that perspective. It doesn't comfort me to know that you have the same problems, but it certainly helps our fellow travelers know that they'll experience a similar thing when they visit Canada. Canyon Overlook says, Sky Caps at O'Hare could make $75,000 a year in the late 80s. Sky Caps are the people who stand out on the curb or the drop-off area to help you with your bags at the airport. And yes, that is a tip expected position. And I think that, with less people carrying cash, I think the Sky Caps probably make less because there's just less people giving them dollars. I forgot to mention this one, but an area that you will see people tip is at the airport. If you take a rental car shuttle and maybe they helped you with your bags or something like that, I generally don't tip the rental car shuttle or the parking lot driver, unless they really went out of my way. The time I tipped the parking lot driver was when I was like, hey, I'm super late for my flight. If there's any way you can go straight to Terminal 7 and not stop by Terminal 1 through 6, I'd really appreciate it. And so he did me a solid by going over there, and so he got a tip on his way. And Brooklyn Joe says he never got his windows cleaned, but he got a laugh. Says, I generally feel uncomfortable going to Costco because of the membership. At self-checkout, they ask to see your card close up in their hand to see if the picture matches. Makes me feel like a crime. Interesting that you feel uncomfortable at the self-checkout. They ask to see your card at the full-service checkout too. So, yeah. The reason, I would say, here's what I do at Costco. And, maybe it avoids this. I don't, as soon as I see an employee coming to me at self-checkout, I hand them my card before they have to ask for it. It takes the uncomfortable transaction away. By the way, why are they doing this at Costco now? Because too many people were giving their membership cards to other people, and then they'd come to self-checkout, and nobody would check their picture. So, that's why they do it. It doesn't make you feel better, but I would suggest maybe you consider that to know they're going to make the ask and just hold it out right in front of their face. Ralph says, I love the no tipping here in Japan. And Justin says, maybe we tipped up front, we'd get better service. Maybe. Or you'd be like, it's $20 on the table. Every time your service gets worse, I take a few dollars away. You never know. Jason says, do you tip the courtesy hotel driver if you have no bags? I guess in the case that I said of the parking lot shuttle, if they're really going to help me out or do something extraordinary or wait for me or whatever, maybe. But if I'm just riding the shuttle, no. That's me. You can decide to do something different. And I say that to say that, tipping, I think, is a personal experience about you and their service. And, did they make you laugh? Did they do a puppet show? I don't know, right? But that's a little bit of what should inspire you to give the tip, is to be like, was this a great experience over everything else? And therefore, I want to use some of my dollars to let them know what they did was awesome. And so this is not intended to be a rant or cast about how we should never tip anybody again. I think it can feel good to tip people, and it can feel good for those people to receive the tip. But we need to stop these uncomfortable situations of the handout all the time. How much do I get for my tip? Press the button right here while you're in front of me. Sean says, I should talk about tips in other countries besides the USA. And it's, the thing is about the USA and Canada, not a lot of tips in most other countries besides the USA and Canada. So that would probably make for a very short live stream. But Sean, thanks for the suggestion. Charla says, people have become such beggars. Why do I have to tip for a transaction at a small business? TP says, did you say to tip the Uber driver in cash? The Uber driver would likely prefer it if you tip in cash. I generally tip them in cash, and they love it. You know, if I say like, hey, do you prefer the tip here, or do you prefer the tip in the app? 99% of them will be like, yeah, just hand me the 20. Thanks. Codge Full of Love says, tipping during travel excursions is crazy. They'll expect like a $40 tip per person. I assume that's if you're doing like cruises or things like that in the excursions. Thank you for that perspective. Brooklyn Joe says, I went to a baseball game in Tampa in 2000, including unlimited drinks, gave the woman $40 and said, keep the beers coming. I was not sober at the end of the game. There you go. That's that tipping up front. So good job, Joe. Justin says, if I'm drunk and my math doesn't add up, which has priority? If I'm drunk and my math doesn't add up, which has priority, the tip amount or the total? I don't really know, Justin. I don't really have a good answer for you. You says, I've had Costco employees having a problem with me covering my picture on my card for them to scan the barcode where other relaxed employees don't mind. And I would just say, then don't cover it up. Just, you know, I mean, just be upfront about it, right? It's you. It's me. Look, it's me. It's okay. I think it's like, it's when you cover it up, then they start to have that dialogue. Anyway, just put it in their face. Here it is. Here you go. And Andy says upfront tipping is underrated. And Ice Cold Beverage says, if I'm drunk, I'm more worried about tipping over than tipping. Yes, that's a good one too. The good news is my peach hibiscus tea, I'm not going to tip over after drinking too much of the peach hibiscus tea. The real Brenda King says, how much do you tip in Vegas for the free drinks while you play slots? I think $1 for a tip is reasonable. Again, they're like high volume transactions, so this person is bringing a lot of drinks to a lot of people, so I don't think it's more than $1 or $2 per drink, because if you're tipping $20 per drink or $5 per drink and the next person is, I mean, that adds up pretty quickly. So really think about that, like how much effort did it take this person and how many of these transactions are they going to do per hour or per day, that can then help you decide like how much is each one worth. Janelle Travels says, do you have a Vegas trip coming up? I potentially have a Vegas trip coming up. I like to always make my what's new in Vegas in the next year. What's new in Vegas in 2024. I haven't like firmed in the days yet, but I do want to go see the new Fontainebleau Hotel, which is opening on December 15th. So I'm trying to target my visit to do a review of the Fontainebleau. And Joe says, I thought handshakes make good tips in Vegas. Hey, if that works for you, Joe, especially if you're taking pictures of those showgirls on the strip, let me know. Mix Kebab says, first time catching you from the UK. Thank you very much. Just wanted to say thanks for what you do. We visit San Francisco after watching your tour of Fisherman's Wharf. Mix Kebab, I appreciate it very much. It's Sarah. This is a good one. I love this. Sarah. I got pizza to go and the machine asked for a tip. 2 days later, I still feel guilty for selecting $0. Sarah, I'm not laughing about your plight, but I'm like, that's it. Like, pizza to go. Should you give a tip? No, you shouldn't give a tip. So, Sarah, I'm here to tell you, don't feel guilty. Okay? Does that make you feel better? Hopefully it does.
Yes, it's the time you've been waiting for. It's time for the giveaway.
All right, fellow explorers, it's time for the giveaway. Every live stream, I give away a Yellow Productions Crew, not pillow, but a Yellow Productions Crew shirt to somebody who can answer one of my questions. And my question is about something I always talk about in the video. And so my question to you today is, there was a receipt I was showing earlier where they charged a service charge, and then they had some boxes you could add for an additional tip What restaurant was that at? If you are the first person who can put that answer in the chat, then you will win a Yellow Productions Crew shirt shipped to you anywhere in the world. If you want to pick one up, you can pick one up from the Yellow Productions shop right here. If you're like, Chris, when is the next live stream? You can sign up for the Yellow Productions update right here, where I'll send you an email every time I know the topic and the date. All right, and if you don't want to buy a shirt, but you want to help support the channel, a great way to do that is by joining and becoming a channel member. We had a couple of 5-month channel members on the live stream today, so thank you very much to these cool people here who are some of the channel members on Yellow Productions. And
now we have a winner chicken dinner.
All right, and congratulations to who's it going to be? With me now, who's it going to be? It's going to be Panjo. Congratulations, Panjo. This was one that Panjo didn't guess ahead of time and stick in there. The second place goes to FL. And you know what, FL? Because I'm feeling extra generous today, because there were only 2 right answers, FL, you're going to win a Yellow Productions Crew shirt in addition to Panjo. So FL, Panjo, send me an email, chris@yellow-productions.com. You'll find it in the description, and I'll get some Yellow Productions Crew shirts heading out to both of you. By the way, Panjo, Gilberto, who I think has the current record of number of shirts, asked how many times you've won so far. So Panjo, have you counted them up? How many shirts have you won so far? I'd like to know. And if you don't know off the top of my head, I can go look and see how many shirts I've shipped to you. But those are always really impressive. Panjo must be like taking copious notes to remember those things. All right, well, fellow explorers, it's always great to hang out with y'all today. As usual, I won't say goodbye because I'll see you in the next video. I hope you enjoy taking your travel train to someplace fun. All right,